Cool. Let's start. Can you all hear me all right? Cool. Okay, so my name is Jamie, and I work for a company called FreelyGive. And we specialize in native Drupal CRM, and it's what we've been doing and talking about for quite a while now. And as a result of that, when GDPR came along, to a lot of our clients, it was very important because our Drupal sites were their primary stores of information, both their front-end stuff and all the business processes. So we teamed up with a company called BRAINSUM, and we've been working on this GDPR module. Now, this talk is going to be, some of you may have already seen Balu and BRAINSUM did a talk on Tuesday about a suite of all the different kinds of GDPR modules that exist and that you can use, and talking about the advantages and disadvantages. We're going to be focusing on the one that is at /projects GDPR, and I'm going to give you a live demo of exactly how to use it, how to set it up, etc., etc. Right, so the first thing is, this is where you can find the GDPR module. It's at /GDPR, and it's actually a suite of quite a few different tools. It started off life as a checklist, which is there to give you some help of the kinds of things you need to do to become compliant. But it's kind of grown into something much bigger. Now, it's important to note that, as with all GDPR modules, there's never going to be a silver bullet that totally means that you install it and suddenly you're compliant and everything's fine. This is a set of tools to help you, but actually GDPR is complicated, people have different views on it. This is there just to help your DPOs or whoever's in charge of this stuff achieve that kind of compliance. Now, can I get a show of hands? Who's been to a talk on GDPR before here? Right. And is there anyone who is, this is the first talk about GDPR that they've ever been to? Oh, right. Okay, cool. Well, I won't go into a lot of the detail of exactly what the legislation is about. There is a whole bunch of different opinions that people have about exactly how to be compliant about this. And you'll find lots and lots of talks about this online from different perspectives. What I'm going to focus on is some specific areas of GDPR and the specific modules we've built to help solve them. So, has anyone tried installing this module before now? I have a show of hands of, okay. It's been in a bit of flux. We're really, obviously it would be nice to have everything completely solved before May 25th. But there's still quite a lot of work going on it. So it's still in alpha stage. But I think we're pretty close to, in the next few weeks, having it to a place where at least it can get to beta. Although we are using this on live production sites, both us and BRAINSUM. So the first thing to see here is, I won't go through it in loads of detail, but the thing that it started off is a checklist. And this will be really helpful at explaining some of the concepts behind GDPR and how to help your organization. The two main areas I'm going to focus on are GDPR consent and GDPR field settings. And just to give you a feel for it, consent is a bunch of tools to help manage obtaining consent from people and an audit trail later on. And then GDPR field settings is to help you set up your site to allow people to export their data upon request and completely delete all their data if they're needed, but dealing with some of the problems that you'll likely encounter when trying to achieve that. So the first thing is, if I click GDPR and go to agreements, what we have is a slightly different approach to, there's another module called the GDPR consent module, and there's also a module called the legal module, and both do something very similar to this. The main difference, I would say, between this and the other modules is the other modules assume that you're only going to have one thing to consent to on your site. And it's a case of take it or leave it, that you either consent or you don't. Now, a lot of organizations have opted for this approach to consent. The organizations we worked for interpreted the law to mean that we needed multiple different kinds of consent. So you might have an organization that handles booking tickets to come to an event with the organization. And there'll be some kind of data processing required for that you need to consent to. They might have marketing emails. And marketing emails, again, you might want to come to the event but not receive the marketing email, so now there's two different things to consent to. There might be a marketing email for resources after the event, like maybe after Drupal Dev Days, you want to click a button to say, yes, send me links to all the talks, or a resource package of all the different slides. And that's something that you want to make it so that people consent to explicitly in a way that is different to the implicit consent that they have to do for coming to your event. So what we've done is we've created a new entity. It's a consent agreement, and these are different things that you can consent to. So I'll show you editing one. Yeah, so the title is for administrative purposes. There are two types of consent, explicit and implicit. Explicit is one where somebody has to physically click a checkbox in order to do that. Again, different organizations have different interpretations of when this is needed, but one pretty much surefire reason to do explicit consent is when somebody's consenting to receiving marketing emails. And the thing they're consenting to is not necessary for the processing of whatever it is that you need to do with them. Implicit consent is they don't have to click a box. So implicit consent will just manage the text that appears of what they're doing. Maybe coming to Drupal Dev Days, we're going to keep your data to help you with customer support stuff, to handle any financial obligations that we have, et cetera, et cetera. And this is implicit because anyone who clicks save on that form, anyone who uses your services in any way, they need to consent to these things, otherwise there's no point continuing. We then have two places where you can display information to an end user. We have a description and we have a long description. And I'll show you when you see the form, a description is what appears on the form directly, and long description appears in a little question mark that when you click, JavaScript will kind of open up and you can read in more detail. Again, one of our clients really requested this because what they wanted was a brief description of what you're consenting to, and when you clicked a button, they would have a huge amount of detail of exactly how your data is going to get used. Other organizations prefer to handle all of the detail in one mammoth privacy policy. So again, these are tools to help you achieve what you're wanting to achieve, what your DPO and what your clients are looking for. We're not trying to define exactly how to interpret these laws perfectly. Now, finally, no, not quite finally, one thing that we find that we have tried to do everywhere throughout this module is we have this notes field here. Now, this tool is not quite aimed, the tool is not quite aimed at developers, and it's not quite aimed at site builders. The aim is to eventually make this good enough for a DPO to use. Now, DPO is someone who's going to understand data protection law quite well. They're going to understand the data your organization has, and they're going to understand how that data is used. So they're going to be a bit techie. They're going to be a bit, kind of understanding the nature of Drupal and where it stores its information, but they won't quite be a developer. And so we've provided some tools to help them a bit with their own documentation that they'll need for GDPR auditors. And so here we have these notes where you'll start talking about the rationale behind this agreement. One thing you'll find throughout a lot of the documentation with GDPR is it's less about ticking a box and simply complying, and more about showing that you've argued your case, that you've thought about why this data is needed. So if you're asking for an end user to consent to some piece of information, you've got some good reason why you're keeping that data. You're not just randomly hoovering up as much data about someone as possible, but you've got a good reason for it. And this is a good place to put that. Finally, like the legal and GDPR consent module, all of these GDPR consent agreements are revisionable. And when you consent to a very specific consent, it will store exactly which revision they kept. We don't force you to keep updating it. There are some modules that do that, but at least we'll know that when that user consented to that thing, we know the exact wording that they consented to, and this is a requirement of GDPR. The way we've decided to do it is once you've done your consent agreement, you then attach this as a field to a specific entity. So we're using the profile types in Drupal 8 core, so I'm putting everything on the notes profile type for now. And if I manage those fields, I can see there is this new GDPR consent field type that we can attach. And then when I attach it and I edit this, I can see this is normal field settings that hopefully you're used to, but you can select which specific agreement. and it will pull across all of the information and all of the data and all of the wording and whether or not it's implicit or explicit from the agreement. What that means is you can put these fields a bunch of different places. You might put them on the user registration form. You might have a user dashboard where you put them. You might have some new special sign-up form, and you're going to put these consents a bunch of different places. But there's a single place for the DPO to see the wording. We found this is a problem with quite a lot of people managing this without something like this, that they update the wording in one place, but somewhere else there's slightly different legal wording or slightly different privacy policy. So, just to show you what it looks like from the end user's perspective, we haven't put very much effort into making this demo site look good from a front-end thing. Everything's just in Bartik, but you can see here's my consent field, which I can click. Here's a long description. Here's a question mark, but the JavaScript stuff hasn't made it, so it hides and disappears. And this, at the moment, is just in their user dashboard. When they click My Account, they can see the notes. But as an admin, when I go into their user dashboard, I can see an audit trail of that they agreed to consent to this. And it will keep track of changes if they've not consented or unconsented. It will keep track of that, of when they did that. Now, we've also done a lot of effort to make it so that staff members can do this, things like this on their behalf. I'll show you some screens later on of it looking from our native Drupal CRM perspective. But when a member of staff, so in this case it's the admin, tries to consent, they have consent notes here where they can type in how that happened. So maybe I was on the phone with them and they consented to receiving newsletters, so I'm going to type on I had a phone conversation at this time. Maybe it's through like a paper form, and a member of staff is putting these things into the system and they're going to type that there. Again, different organizations have different interpretations about how this consent stuff works. Is there any questions before I move on about this? Yeah. Why do we need? Yeah, so you attach these consents to the forms that you want to use, and they can be any forms and anywhere that you can put a field. So for this demo, I've done it on a profile field, and what we've found for a lot of our clients is they've had a lot of different consent fields for consenting to various forms of marketing. So it might be email, phone, SMS, etc. So rather than consenting to one thing, it's been a collection, and we've put it on a communications profile entity. Oh, sorry, for the recording, that question was why were we using the profile entity to put these things on? And my answer is that, and also, yeah, you could put it on the user registration form instead, the user entity instead. There's a whole bunch of places you could put it. That's another question. Yeah, so have we figured a nice way of making it work with the MailChimp module, was the question. Yes and no. So our main client is using the MailChimp module, and what we've done is actually, it's ended up being kind of hacky. What we've done is we've used the MailChimp module, and then we've used this GDPR consent module. We've hidden all the MailChimp stuff, and we've made them sync with each other. That's how we're doing things right now, because we've got it working in Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. My plan for Drupal 8, having gone down this road with having a new field, is rather than having a field for consents, we're going to want to make it so that we can attach consent stuff to an already existing module, so that the fields that the MailChimp already uses, we can attach it to that, so that we can then do consent properly with an audit trail. We've been speaking to the guy who's been doing the GDPR consent module. Hopefully, as a result of this, we can start working on it. And I think that would be a much more elegant solution than what we've currently done with fields, because every single module has its own field for essentially managing consent, except they don't track, they don't do an audit trail, and they don't do the audit trail in one place. So we have a plan to do that more effectively, but for now, the way that we do it is we make this field visible, and we sort of hackily sync the data in this field with the MailChimp stuff. Cool. I will move on unless there's any more questions. Yeah. So this was a question about what data you need in the consent audit trail. Yeah, we've gone for the time who consented, so whether or not it was a member of staff or them themselves, who is about, and the changes. We haven't gone for IP address. IP address is complicated because IP address is personally identifiable information, so we kind of shied away from putting IP address all over the place. Yeah. So we use the messages module. You'll see a dependency on the messages module to handle the audit trail. It wouldn't be that hard to make it so that you also recorded the IP address on the audit trail if you wanted to, if you felt that was necessary. We haven't. That's just a decision that we made. I think one of the issue with a lot of these GDPR things is it's so unclear exactly what is necessary. And I think it's kind of it's less up to you as a developer and up to the data controller or the client to decide what they absolutely need. If you wanted to store the IP address on the audit trail, that would be very possible because it's a message entity. Yeah. Cool. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on to showing you the GDPR fields settings. So if I've gone through this, the field settings. So we're going to talk about, so if you haven't heard about GDPR before, I'm going to very quickly talk about, there's a lot of different rights that people have access to. And the two that we have focused on building for is right to access / right to portability and right to be forgotten or / right to erasure. These are the things that we have put the most effort into building, and it's been a lot of effort. This is probably most of the code is in this. GDPR consent is relatively simple. This stuff is much more complicated. Now, you don't have to necessarily use these modules. If somebody asks for their data, you could decide to have a developer do a database dump and hand it to the person needed. Equally, with right to be forgotten, you could decide to go around deleting everything. You could delete the user like you can with Drupal, delete the user, delete all their content, and that would be the way of erasing things. But one thing we've found is that a lot of the time in Drupal, especially in the CRM world, but I think you'll find it with your websites when your website is more like a web application, we'll find that actually deleting a user and all of its content is a bit annoying. It kind of ruins reports. So what I've got here is, these are all nodes, so it's not a real event system, but imagine this was an event system where I can book tickets to various different events. And I've got the price of those events, the price of those tickets, because in this weird world, people can type in whatever they want to pay, the different events that they wanted to go to, their postal addresses, staff notes about them, the name on the ticket, and who booked them on. In this world, if somebody asks to be removed, we do want to anonymize them, we do want to get rid of them from the system, but actually making it so that in the past we delete the fact that they came to the event and change the numbers for the event is not ideal. And making it so that the ticket prices all vanish, and so when I look back at how much money I made from that event, it starts changing depending on people deleting their data. Again, it's not ideal. So we've built some tools to help achieve this. I'm going to show you a demo, and you'll see how this website changes, this view changes. So the first thing we've got is, when we go to GDPR and fields list, we've made this mammoth GDPR field list page. What this does is it starts with the user entity and goes through the whole site looking for every single entity that might be linked with the user in any way whatsoever. Even ones that are really bizarre for GDPR because they're really only going to be linked to site builders. So if you look, the first one is custom block. Let's say you've got some weird site where random people can come to your site and create complete custom blocks and use a layout editor because you've enabled it to authenticated users to just put random custom blocks on the page. Then this is where you would start configuring that if you decided that was important. However, most of the time, there's a lot of entities that are useless, so we've built various different tools to help filter things, search, and filter out entities where all fields are not configured. So I'm going to click that so we can see the entities that I've previously configured. And what we can see here is two different entity types called, which I've made, which are nodes called ticket and audit trail. Audit trail, I'm going to show you a little bit about deleting messages in this audit trail. Now what you can do is you can see all the different fields, their field types, and their status in right to access and right to be forgotten, and any of their notes, which again, this is for a DPO. This is so that a single human being can see one place in a tree of everywhere where user data would be stored. I know that Drupal already has a fields listing, so it's very similar to the thing that you get in reports anyway, but this is now aimed at a DPO, so it has filtering for them, and it has notes for them so that if they ever get audited, they can quickly see the rationale for why they did this. If I were to click edit on one of them, I'm going to, looking at the ticket, I'm going to start with the ticket name, which is the title of this node, but in my world, it is the name on the ticket. And we see we have these options. Now, if you try and edit the field through the normal field UI, you'll see these same options again of specifying whether or not it's a GDPR field and what you want to do. The options for right to access are included, but may be included and not included. Throughout our system, we feel that the maybes are very, very important because we think there are lots of times, especially in notes fields, where you'll have data where it's not clear whether or not there's person identifiable information on it. If you have a note, let's say you're, again, running an event, and there are some dodgy people who come along and you want to watch out for them, or maybe you want to ban them from the event, so you want to type in the notes, I would like to ban this person. Or maybe they had an incident with their health or something at the event. If there's person identifiable information in a note, you might choose to include it in their export. We find the maybes aren't as useful in the right to access as they are in the right to be forgotten. In right to be forgotten, there's a lot of times where there are fields which are, you really want somebody, a member of staff to check. So that's why we have this maybe. Included means it gets included in the download export that they can do, and not included means it's not included. It seems silly to include that, but the reason why we have this not included is it's very, very important over and over again that you justify to an auditor why you've done what you've done. So if I've done not included, it shows that some member of staff hasn't just accidentally left it not included, but they consciously decided that this data doesn't need to be included in the export. And then you've got your notes so you can justify your rationale. Then for right to be forgotten, there are a number of options. Anonymize, may be included, not included, and okay, we can't see it because this is a title, but we'd also have remove. Most of the time, when you're doing right to be forgotten, you'll probably want to just remove the data. That's the simplest. But there's a couple of times where, again, we've got the example of tickets, where removing just doesn't quite cut it, and anonymizing would be the better option. With the anonymizer, we've built a whole bunch of different sanitizers to use, and this works with a couple of the other GDPR modules. There's another module that BRAINSUM have built for doing database dumps using Drush for all your dev sites. And we're using the same sanitizers there so that there's, for different field types, you know, date is going to do something different. Email is always going to have an @ in it. And I'm using the username anonymizer because the username anonymizer puts the word anon underscore as a prefix before having something random so that you can see the things that have been anonymized versus things that are maybe spam or weird looking random usernames. Okay, I'm going to go into some more detail with some advanced GDPR settings. But before I move on, does anyone have any questions about that first? Yeah. Yes. So yeah, so that question was, will the GDPR module only work on the GDPR fields shown? And the answer is yes. So that's, to me, that's the main point of it, is to have a lot of control over it. There is some argument of whether or not we want to make it so that it works with random database fields. I think if you're using lots and lots of random database fields that aren't in fields, as in field API fields, then you'll probably want to do something custom. But if anyone wanted to try and use this GDPR field settings for things other than fields, then that would be an interesting conversation in the issue queue of how we can move forward with that. Does that answer your question? Cool. Yeah. So there's some issues about that at the moment. We're definitely planning on. I don't know the current state of how much we've supported multilingual yet. But that's definitely on the roadmap, and it's obviously very important. It just hasn't been, it hadn't been done last time I checked, but it was being worked on, so I don't know its current state. Again, this stuff is all available in Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. The current state of it in Drupal 7 is a bit more mature, There's some pull requests that we're hoping to have sorted the next couple of days that will make it better in Drupal 8 as well. Right, so now there's a couple of small little advanced things. We're really hoping to improve the UI. We've already got some ideas for how to improve it. It's a little bit complicated now, but this is to deal with stuff where, well, if I am a user and I book on some tickets to events, I'm probably going to sometimes book on more than one ticket, or maybe I'm uploading more than one photo. And when you have at the moment we export everything in CSV files, but when you have more than one thing, CSVs aren't ideal for storing a whole bunch of stuff. And also there's sometimes very complicated things where entities can relate to each other in some ways. Like I could imagine a Netflix built on Drupal where you had a user entity where I booked a subscription, which was a subscription entity, and on that subscription I had family members on my subscription, and those family members were attached to user entities that belonged to their family members. So when we come along and ask for right to be forgotten, who owns what data? Well, I would suggest that the first person who has a family owns all the data on that subscription, and when they export it, they can see who they've signed up for their subscription. The family members don't necessarily have the right to access all the data that that other person did. They won't necessarily have the right to see all the other members on their family subscription. So you have to trace the ownership a little bit when you start doing things that are advanced. So one example of a field is the ID field. So when I look at a particular entity, the ticket entity, which is a node, I go to the primary key, the ID, and I can see a couple of new things. So firstly, right to access file name. You might want to put everything in main if it's simple and not with multiple cardinality. If you have more than one ticket per user, you'll probably want to create a new CSV file, which we have here, called tickets. So when they download it, all their tickets will appear in a separate place. We also have the option for, instead of removing the data one by one for everything in the entity, you can just delete the entire entity itself. Not keep the entity there and delete all its fields, but delete the whole entity. And I think for something like the audit log, which we'll see in a bit, it's more appropriate to just delete a lot of the log files if that's what you want to do. And there's lots of other places throughout the site where you don't want to, you've got huge questionnaires or something. There's loads of data. You don't have to click through each one of them. You just want to delete the whole entity, and it's gone. Then for, so if I'm looking at the ticket again, when I use entity reference, so here I have authored by, classic node who authored it. That's the person who created this ticket in the first place. That is linked to a person. When I edit this, I get to this page where I can talk about what the relationship is. And there are a number of options here. Do not follow this relationship means, let's say I want to, a lot of the time you're referencing, let's say, taxonomy. You might be referencing a taxonomy entity. You want to include that they picked, that they really love, you're asking a question, are they a cats or a dogs person? You want them to know that they're a dog person. They want to pull that out. But behind the scenes, you've got loads of settings of how the people who are dog people, they show up in a specific color in the forum. In that case, you don't want to follow the relationship because you don't want to export also all your configuration about that taxonomy. You just want to export the taxonomy itself. So in this case, we use do not follow this relationship. Then we have these things which, again, the wording needs to be improved, but the content owns the reference user, or the content is owned by the reference user. And in this case, the content, which is the ticket, is actually a ticket that is owned by the user that is the end of this entity reference. The person who authored this, they own the ticket, and so then I would select that here. Sometimes it's the other way around, and which is the content I'm dealing with right now, the ticket is actually owning the other one. And so when you're using entity reference, you can set the setting up on either side, and that's how you handle those references. So I'm now going to go into exactly how these tasks are processed. We believe strongly that neither of the, you've got in the GDPR legislation, you have 30 days to comply with these things. We believe very strongly that we don't really want any of these two options, right to access or right to be forgotten, to happen immediately. We think there's far too much that can go wrong with most larger organizations. You might disagree, and for a smaller site, maybe you want to be able to just press a button and it just happens naturally. Or maybe you're a really big site, so Facebook, you don't want to have members of staff checking through every single thing, so you want to do it in a fully automated way. That's fine. But for most Drupal sites, we think we need it to happen quickly. We need to happen with a member of staff. So we've built these tools here where somebody can go to a user profile, they click My Account, they click Data Requests, and they can request those things. Now, I've already done this. Now, then we've built this page where we go to GDPR tasks, where we have a task list for staff to process it. You have to run cron. So if I go to Devil run cron for it to build these tasks, because they're a little bit complicated. And we can see a couple of different tasks that are processed. So destroy user 5 is the person I've created to destroy for this demo. And we can see they've got a right to access request, SARS request, and they've got a removal request. So let me process their right to access first. Here we can see a little task summary for your member of staff, the user it's about, who requested it, was it a member of staff, and some information about them, including where the maybes will be, so you can go and find those. We can manually include CSV files that we want because we might have got it from some other system. And we can manually include a whole bunch of files like images if that's needed. It will also work with image fields as far as media fields as far as I know, and bring those JPEG files or whatever that they've uploaded. And I can actually just download it here and send it to them by email, or I can click process. And when I click process, that person will be able to go to all your data and my data requests and, oh wait, sorry, I have to run cron first. That person will go to their data and they'll be able to see a place where they can download it. And this wasn't working before, but now it is. Yeah, and they can see the CSV files that they've that we've prepared for them. Right, so that's that. Now, the final thing before we finish is here is removal. There's not much we have to do here because we haven't done much with the maybes, but with the dietary notes, we're going to leave this in, but maybe what we'd do is if there was something in that dietary note, we'd have to manually go into it, into the system, and remove that stuff. But I'm just going to remove and anonymize data. Right. And what we find is, got too many tabs open. Destroy user 5 has now been turned to anonymous Caro 11, but the other information is still kept. Now, because we do stuff with native Drupal CRM, well, actually, you can do things as a member of staff. You can go to use their dashboard and see things. But I just want to show you that it's possible that if I go to a person's, this is sort of like their anonymous stuff, some dashboards behind the scenes. There's a GDPR tab, and here I can see an audit trail of their tasks that they've done, linked to their tasks, and as a member of staff, I can also request data export and data removal with some request notes here to talk about like why, you know, was it over the phone, et cetera, et cetera. So, right. So my final couple of points is there's some other GDPR tools which I haven't gone here through the checklist, the obfuscated SQL dump, and we're hopefully adding more to it. And we have a roadmap. It's got quite comprehensive as a result of the GDPR workshop from yesterday, but we have a roadmap where we're going to handle backup and restore, and I'll talk a bit about that in some other videos. But basically we handle it by keeping a record of who, of the IDs of who's being asked to be forgotten, so that when you restore from a backup, you can reapply that. Some people think that you have to actually go to the backup and delete everything, and there's some ideas of how we do that. We want some tools for views data export to make it so that if a client exports the data, we keep a record of who is in that export, where it's located, And so when you try and remove data, you've got an audit trail of exactly all the different Excel or CSV files in your organization and where they're kept, a whole bunch of improvements to the UI, and finally external systems API. We're very keen on, for us, because we do CRM, all our data is stored on one Drupal site. For many of you, you'll find that a lot of your data is stored in like MailChimp, and as was asked before, a whole bunch of CRM systems and things. And we have some plans to make this system communicate with other systems more effectively using some kind of consistent JSON format. So yeah, thanks. Bunch of links, our company names, there's some videos of this module, and that's the end of my session. Cool, so we have 10 minutes for any questions. Sure, thanks.
I have two questions. The first, thank you for all the work that you've done there. That's quite impressive.
You're welcome.
I think that there is something beyond GDPR, which is related to data retention period.
Yes.
We have to re-ask validation of the approval from the user after a certain period of time that you can decide.
Yeah. It's not planned yet. It is something that I hear a lot about. Data retention is part of the data protection policy, Data Protection Act anyway, so it's been a thing for a long time. I find a lot of clients kind of ignore it. I think it would be very easy for us to add that to the GDPR field settings. So as a feature request on the GDPR module, I would be happy to hear that and have ideas of how we could do that exactly. And your second question, oh sorry, the question was for any recording do we have any plans on the roadmap for handling data retention policies, because there's a requirement of both GDPR and the Data Protection Act to only store data for a certain amount of time, and then sometimes you have to actually ask for permission again to keep it for longer. And was that on the roadmap? And my answer was that.
The second point is related to stability. On the project page on Drupal.org, we see that the module is having the warning because it's in NAFTA release right now. What is the roadmap blockers to reach the beta status or
Yeah.
stable status?
So the question was about stability, and we're in the alpha stage. Is a roadmap to get to the beta stage? Yes, it is. We're pretty much feature complete. We just need to port some stuff from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, and then we can move into a beta stage. BRAINSUM in the GDPR workshop yesterday put together they put a Google Doc. We're on Rocket Chat, so we got in the GDPR thing on Rocket Chat, and we posted some stuff there. We've got a Google Doc for how we're going to move forwards on our roadmap before we get to beta. Cool. Are there any more questions? Sure. Yep.
Are you obligated to delete that information?
As far as any of our clients has dealt with, I have not heard anyone that suggests that consent only works for a period of time. It's only very important that people can revoke that consent. Data retention policies are a little bit different, but consent stuff, I haven't heard anything that says that consent is linked to a specific period of time. Oh, sorry, the question was whether or not the consent stuff will get revoked after a period of time, requiring them to update it. I think I have heard some organizations where they have done something where they try and ask every few years for it. It's not a feature that we have planned. It could definitely be asked for. And there was a question there.
My question is, I didn't get the specific case. For example, the case with the tickets, can we say give opportunity to users only choose the specific options, not all of them, just maybe, for example, for specific cases? Can we use the rights to kind of control this process?
Can we use user rights? So the question was, can we use user rights to control the process where people can request maybes versus not? I think the user only can just request one thing or the other. And then once they've requested one thing or the other, it's up to a member of staff to handle all of the things. So including the maybes, a member of staff will have to do it. Now, we did have some ideas of cool tools to make it so that you could automatically put the maybes in. Right now, it's super manual. If you want to deal with the maybes, you basically make a CSV file yourself and you upload it into the task. So it's the staff have complete control over what goes out. Again, I think this is very good for smaller sites, for even medium-sized sites. For something like Facebook, you need to never have any maybes, basically. You need everything to be automated, and you need to make sure that your structure is such that everything is automated. Because otherwise it's a very time-consuming process. Most of our clients haven't received that many requests, so it hasn't mattered too much to try and make the staff process faster. Cool. We've got 5 more minutes. There's a question here.
Well, how do we prove that a user is deleted, or even, for example, in BRAINSUM, for example, isn't it better to just remove subscription so that the user never gets bothered again with a newsletter, for example?
Cool. So the question was about sort of why do we want to do this removing everything? Isn't it better to do something like just remove the subscription? And how do you prove that you haven't that you've actually deleted everything? That was the question, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's 2 different things basically: consent to receive marketing information, and right to your data being processed. I've simplified it into 2 things. If you actually look at the law, there's a whole bunch of different rights. And revoking your right to processing is a separate right that GDPR has done. So it is important for you to give people the ability to ask not to be bothered anymore. But GDPR does make an explicit new right, which is specifically right to erasure. And erasure means any personally identifiable information about them is totally purged from the system, so there's no physical way that you as a company could even sign them up again, even if you wanted to. It's deleted from everywhere. It's deleted from pieces of paper. It's deleted from Excel spreadsheets, from Outlook. You know, every single place that you have their personally identifiable information is gone. Exactly how extreme you need to be with this is massively up for debate. I've even heard debates about whether or not somebody has a right to ask for every single email they've sent to you to be purged from the system. And I've heard some people who think that's ridiculous. The reality is you'll probably want to speak to a lawyer or listen to all the other talks or come to your own conclusion. Our tool is to help you manage it. But it does seem like it's very important that you delete all that data as much as possible, which is why I talked about the backup stuff, because there are some people who argue that when somebody asks to be forgotten, you should delete it from your database, but also every single backup. Go into the backups directly and delete just their data. That would seriously harm your backups, and if you're using tape backups, that would be very, very, very costly and difficult. So our approach has been this medium ground, which we have legal reasons to believe that's acceptable, but it's still not certain. So that's why it's important to delete it, because that's just an explicit thing GDPR requires us to do. How do you prove it? I don't know. I don't know how you'll get in trouble for it. But what I think could happen is if you accidentally, let's say you revoke their access, and then you accidentally, someone in your staff accidentally signs them up manually, then they'll be like, how do you even have that data in the first place? Because I asked you to delete it a year ago. At that point, you would maybe get audited, and an auditor would want to come along and check that you deleted it. And that's why we have all of our tools, like all of our tasks, all of our audit trail means that I could come along and say to someone, no, we definitely deleted it 2 years ago. You can see this thing, and they signed up and consented for us to receive it a year and a half later. So an auditor coming into your organization and might prove it. And until we get people being fined for GDPR, we won't know how they do it, how strict are they, how often it happens. One little piece of information about that, the stuff I'm hearing about in terms of likelihood of being in trouble with GDPR is up in the air. But the one piece of information I found was very interesting is in Germany, there is one business that is GDPR compliant. They put a lot of money into it. And they have a competitor who has put no effort into GDPR compliance. So rather than being taken to court or fined by the regulator, they've actually taken this other company to court, saying that they've got a competitive advantage over us because they haven't had to do GDPR compliance. And if that court case happens in Germany, and Germany is likely to be a place where this kind of stuff really, they would take it more seriously. If that happens, one company is going to get some, I don't know if they're going to get their competitor fined, they can maybe get some money from it, they're going to win. And if that happens, I can imagine a lot of companies taking each other to court over GDPR compliance as opposed to regulators. And then we'll see this stuff become much more important because anything you can do to hurt your competitor, they'll want to use. Okay, it's 12 o'clock, so I think, do we have any more questions that are quick or? No, well, thank you for coming. It's been nice chatting to you, and thank you for the interesting questions. Like I said, we're on Rocket Chat. Hit us on Drupal.org. We do a lot of development on GitHub. Thanks for coming.